Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a deeply complex and highly scrutinized geopolitical issue, the situation in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. Over the past decade, this region in northwestern China has been at the absolute center of international debate, policy changes, and extensive human rights assessments. We're going to objectively break down the multifaceted policies implemented there, relying on documented evidence from UN mandates, independent research, and official Chinese government statements. There's a lot to unpack, so let's get right into it.
To help us navigate this, we're following a clear roadmap today. 1. The state's core strategy. 2. Incarceration in the courts. 3. Suppressing culture and religion. 4. Labor and family separation. And finally, 5. Tech and global repercussions.
Starting with Section 1, the state's core strategy, security versus repression. Right off the bat, we have to acknowledge two completely opposing narratives here. On one side, the Chinese government, or Beijing, maintains that its policies are built on vital counterterrorism and economic measures. They state that the region faced severe threats from violent religious extremism and that state interventions, like what they call vocational education and training centers, successfully eliminated violent attacks, brought peace, and lifted people out of poverty. On the flip side, however, the UN and various international human rights bodies report a vastly different reality. They document a massive system of forced assimilation, arbitrary detention, and severe rights violations that they warn may constitute crimes against humanity.
So where did this massive policy shift actually begin? A lot of it traces back to a 2014 internal speech by Chinese President Xi Jinping. He argued that there were seeds of extremism outside the borders and fertile soil within them. By framing the local population's susceptibility as a profound national security threat, this speech really set the stage for an unprecedented campaign of state intervention, high-tech surveillance, and re-education to weed out those perceived seeds.
Moving to Section 2, incarceration and the courts by the numbers. According to a 2024 analysis, the Uyghur region holds the highest incarceration rate in the entire world. Between 2017 and 2022, an estimated 1 in 26 Uyghurs and non-Han Turkic peoples were formally imprisoned. Just to put that into perspective, this population makes up more than a third of China's total prison population, despite representing only about 1% of the country's overall population. And keep in mind, independent researchers stress this specific statistic doesn't even include those held in other forms of detention, like the re-education centers.
To put a human face to these staggering numbers, consider the case of Ekper Assad, which was highlighted by the UN. He was a highly successful Uyghur tech entrepreneur who, in 2016, just disappeared. For 3 years, his family had no idea where he was. The authorities later asserted he was sentenced to 15 years for inciting ethnic hatred, yet no evidence has ever been presented to confirm that a trial even took place. And when he finally had monitored video calls with his family 8 years later, officials forced him to communicate only in Mandarin Chinese, completely stripping away his native language.
Which brings us to a really critical question. When a region has a security and surveillance apparatus this massive, how does it actually impact the everyday culture and lives of the people living there? That leads us into Section 3, suppressing culture and religion, criminalizing the everyday. What independent researchers have found is that the definition of extremism has been applied so broadly that completely ordinary religious practices have been retroactively criminalized. We're talking about totally innocuous behaviors observed by Muslims all over the world, things like fasting during Ramadan, praying daily, choosing halal foods, or using Islamic naming conventions. Authorities have frequently labeled these everyday actions as signs of religious extremism, or even as an illness that requires mandatory re-education. And the real-world consequences of criminalizing the mundane are absolutely devastating. Take Aytila Rosie, who was sentenced to 20 years in prison just for teaching the Quran to a small group of women, or Silihan Rosie, who was handed a 17-year sentence for providing religious education to her sons and a neighbor. And here's the kicker. Silihan's so-called crimes happened at least a decade before her sentencing. Actions that were totally permitted at the time are now being retroactively punished with decades behind bars. But it's not just individuals being targeted. It's physical sacred spaces, too. Back in 2016, under a state campaign literally called the Mosque Rectification Program, an estimated 5,000 mosques were destroyed in just 3 months. Now, authorities cited poor building conditions and safety risks. However, incredible historic sites like the Kargalik Grand Mosque built way back in 1540 were completely bulldozed. Researchers point out this effectively severs the Uyghur people from their personal, cultural, and spiritual history. Moving to Section 4, labor and family separation, re-engineering society. 900,000. By 2019, UN special rapporteurs received information that nearly 900,000 Uyghur children were living full-time in state-run boarding institutions. With so many parents either detained or in exile, these kids are placed in heavily securitized Mandarin-only schools. Reports indicate they have little to no contact with their families or their Uyghur cultural roots, and they face severe penalties just for speaking their native tongue. This staggering centralization of children didn't just happen by accident. It traces straight back to top-level state directives. In that same May 2014 speech, the Chinese president demanded that students should learn in school, live in school, and grow up in school. Chinese academic literature frequently discusses this as a way to optimize the population structure, which independent observers describe as a systemic campaign to dilute minority cultural ties and forcefully assimilate the next generation. At the exact same time, the adult population is facing its own massive mobilization. According to state figures, in 2021 alone, over 3.17 million surplus laborers were transferred across the region under state-mandated poverty alleviation programs. Now, Beijing frames this massive labor transfer as a huge win for economic development, but foreign research institutes and international labor organizations paint a very different picture. They assert these transfers actually constitute coercive state-imposed forced labor. Uyghurs and other minorities are moved into industries like cotton harvesting, textile production, and even polysilicon manufacturing for solar panels under conditions that severely limit their freedom of movement. And there's always the looming threat of internment if they refuse. So what happens when this massive, localized system of labor and surveillance plugs directly into the global economy? Because Xinjiang certainly does not exist in a vacuum, it's a major global industrial hub. That brings us to our final section, tech and global repercussions, the supply chain. When multinational tech and manufacturing companies are audited on their ties to Xinjiang, you see a lot of failing grades. Watchdogs are looking for direct indicators of forced labor in supply chains or active support for state security apparatuses. And right now, the pressure is immense. With the enforcement of laws like the U.S. Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, goods from Xinjiang are presumed to involve forced labor unless proven otherwise. This is forcing major players in the automotive, solar, and apparel industries to completely restructure their supply chains, with several foreign enterprises already announcing their exit from Xinjiang operations entirely. And the tech integration goes both ways. Internal procurement documents prove that the massive surveillance systems tracking citizens throughout Xinjiang, like the Urumqi Cloud Computing Center, are directly powered by processing chips, hard disks, and servers purchased from leading Western technology brands. The global supply chain is deeply, intimately connected to the infrastructure on the ground. Faced with all this evidence, the UN Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights released a landmark report, and their conclusion was incredibly severe. They stated that the sheer scale of the arbitrary detentions and systemic human rights violations in Xinjiang may constitute international crimes, in particular, crimes against humanity. So I want to leave you with this final thought. We are seeing a strategic shift in Xinjiang right now. What started as emergency counterterrorism measures has transitioned into a system of long-term normalized assimilation. As international pressure continues to mount, and as strict new supply chain laws force corporations to really scrutinize where their products come from, how will the global community balance its vast economic interests with these heavily documented, undeniable human rights findings? What actions will define our global response to the complex realities we've unpacked today? Thank you so much for joining us for this explainer, and keep asking the tough questions.